It's really wonderful to be here. When I was listening to the last talk, I was thinking that Hugh is the first person who's pulled me out from under one of those rocks since 1986. I haven't spoken publicly about the grid or any of this since then because I had a severe crisis of confidence. I'm one of those evil anthropologists, PhD'd and everything, and my sense of critical judgment kicks in so hard on myself that I felt pretty much tongue-tied by my research, and I'll tell you part of the story of how I got to where I am now, but I spent about 10 years in retreat with musical instruments, making them, playing violin, and working on the sky grid that I'm going to present today for the first time. And I am just in awe of what I've heard already at this conference. It practically brought me to tears. Just this past summer, I turned my granite boulder-filled backyard into a garden. And when you said that that was just what you need in rock dust, I'm thinking I'm going to go home and lick my rocks. I mean, everything that I've heard has expanded me so much. I'm really moved to be here. So this is our front porch, and I started out in sustainability, and these are our solar cookers, which bring magical vortex sun energy to cook our food. And so I guess I've always been interested in vortexes, but I've kind of stood back from them just because I was academic until fairly recently when I went to Corral, which is the Peruvian site that Hugh talked about, at point 35 on our grid. And at the foot of the Menor Pyramid, I don't know if any of you have been there, but I have a slide of it coming up, carved on the main platform in front of that pyramid is one of those spirals that Hugh showed in his show. Great big spirals, probably this big across. And the whole, everything in that site, the life of the people, the plants, the water, the pyramids, the trade system, everything is a vortex, a living vortex. And it's kind of changed my view of how to think about vortexes and how to think about all these energy lines and telluric currents and everything that we've been talking about today. This, oddly enough, has been my inspirational goddess since I began all this work. This is Tlazolteotl, who's an Aztec aspect of the feminine. They don't really use the divine down there, but I think I've put it in my show sometimes. But if you look at her, there are several things in this representation that I think encompass both the philosophy of the Earth grid and what will be the sky grid, as well as a way of humans living within all this energy. That's probably my focus, is how humans have interpreted and lived within the context of this energy that all of you are focusing upon, and made stories about it, made rituals to attach themselves more fully to it. So what she's actually doing is defecating. And she's called the goddess of filth, but as you can see up here, Aztec, I can't speak Nahuatl, but the language is, from everything I've read about it, it's very poetic in that they'll build these little kinds of etymological closenesses into the ways that they name things, so that filth, tlazol, and tlazol, filth and love are pretty much the same thing. And filth is just our word, but it's really waste, which is turning into corn, which is fertilizing the soil, which is coming back as food. And that's very much influenced me. Here under this foot, she has an instrument that I have been making that's called a bull roarer, which will be one of the corners of this talk. You've probably seen him. Tor spun one at the beginning of his film. And they're just flat. Get it going and not hit the microphone. And whoever spins it will have a unique voice. But this also, as you can see, it has a vortex as a horizontal plane, and it has a spinning plane. So it's a vortex generator. And the other instrument that's under her other foot, this one, is something that some of you may have played with as a child. It's called a magic wheel. You might have played with one with string through a big coat button. And so I made one in that shape, but you can, and I'll be talking more about all of these. Just get them around a couple of fingers. And that shape that she has here is the glyph for movement. And then the other figures that are surrounding her are the day glyphs in the Aztec calendar. So that's one of my primary inspirations in this talk. And then there's your, and the bull roar, interestingly enough, has been found all over the world. And the oldest one was found near Chauvet Cave in France, and it's 40,000 years old. It was carved out of mammoth bone. And so I think that they have 7 or 8 surviving examples of a bull roar from that period, but mostly they call them fugitive artifacts because they just disintegrate. So we really don't have too much of a straight history, but if we're lucky and we pick through history and we find a site with stuff in it, often we find a bull roar. And it's one, if you do go back into ancient history, you find that the magic wheel, this thing, a fire drill that you spin to start fire, loom spindle, spinning top, and the bull roar are very commonly considered to be power ritual instruments, and they're very practical. And also in, well, I'll tell you this later. Those are some of the old ones, just so you can see how the form over all those thousands of years has stayed pretty much the same. Now the geometric figure that has been important in the way that Bill Becker and I developed the grid, the most important form is the rhomb, which is this figure. And the earliest time that we hear about the bull roar, the name given to it is rhombos. And the earliest name given to this was Greek just because that's where the writing is that I can read and that most academics can read. They can't read Hindu very well yet. This was also rhombos. So I'll return to that. But I have that rhomb. This is the Hindu Sri yantra. Is anybody familiar with that? It's the graphic symbol for the mother goddess. And I noticed, I got to looking at rhomb so much that I realized that I could lay the center of it right over the human midbrain. So now part of my thinking about who we are as consciousness is that here's our midbrain at the end of our spinal cord, and it's a rhombic form. And all the traditions talk about the brain essentially being a spinning being, a being of intertwined spinning energies. So that's another influence in this. Now just briefly, I don't think I'm going to have to go over the grid too much since so many people have talked about it, but I love John Michel. I knew him very briefly, but I have to say that my primary influences for the grid were Chris Bird, who wrote The Secret Life of Plants, who was very kind to us with his research. And probably I have to acknowledge the Grateful Dead. I'm a musician. I absolutely love those guys. And there was an article in New Age Journal in 1975, and I kept the magazine because there was an interview with Jerry in there. And then 5 years later, I ran into a picture of the Russian earth grid, and it was on the other side of the article about Jerry Garcia, so I kept it. But I hadn't even seen it, so I credit him in having that. But this Ivan Sanderson really probably started the icosahedron on the globe argument, saying that each one of these areas, so this is the Bermuda Triangle, Hawaii, the Japan Devil's Sea, those. He talked about this on the Arthur Godfrey show. And I bet there isn't anybody here old enough to remember. Well, maybe some people remember. My mom ironed to it, And Arthur, I still don't know whether it was right, but that's where that came from. Pretty much simultaneously, the Russians, and Chris Bird said, don't call them the Russians because that's just like saying the United States people. But it was an engineer and a linguist and a historian. And I was lucky enough in 1994 to actually get to visit Valery Makarov, who was the engineer. And so he told me the story of how they had come up with their grid, and it was basically the two of the men met on a train going to a conference and got to talking about this and thought, man, we should do this. It was just that simple of a thing. But they started not with Giza, like I just assumed that the archaeological evidence with the megaliths that are on the various grid points would have been what they started with. No, they didn't. They started with the dodecahedron on the Earth, and they aligned it with the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And when they did that, putting two of the centers of the pentagons at the north and south axial pole, they found that the alignment was true. Then, when they overlaid the other figure, the icosahedron, onto the Earth symmetrically on top of that, the archaeological sites and the geological stuff and the topography and wind currents. I guess I shouldn't be walking over there. Okay. They fell out as secondary data. And so that got me attuned to thinking that in these conferences, it's so important that we have a British view as well as a US view, and the wider we can expand it internationally to how people see these things, we'll get better insights. Because I never realized how biased I was towards archaeology, even though I'm an anthropologist. And what we added, the man that I was married to at the time, Bill Becker, was a geometer and an industrial designer who worked with Buckminster Fuller. And so he took a look at that Russian pattern with the icosahedron and the dodecahedron, and he said, it's a beautiful symmetry, except for that as a physical structure, the geodesics make more sense to me. So all that we really did was we took their pattern with the black and the green, and we filled in what we saw as what were missing struts in this geometric figure, which had the effect of making every single one of the lines or edges on the grid hook together so that they were a great circle of energy, just like Hugh was talking about. And that figure of lines, of the purple lines that fell out that we put in, this is what's called the rhombic triacontrahedron, which is what Dan Shaw is now selling as Earth Star. And that figure was known by Kepler. It wasn't known by Plato. But it was strange. The year that we first published our work was the first time that rhombic triacontrahedron crystals were found in nature. And so we really were, I guess everybody in here has had this feeling of imminent discovery once they get on the path, and it feels almost like you're creating your data while you go, because it's coming right to you while you're doing it. And we found this map in Hapgood's Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. And if you look at it, you can see they had this pattern of using figures on the landscape. This is really North Africa, and this is Spain. This is the Mediterranean. And you can see the rhombic figure that's very close to this one, which here's Giza in the center here. Here's Giza here. So I mean, it's off, but it's a very similar geometry. So we started looking for remnants of rhombs in ancient maps. And I was going to say something about being a giant from the pre-internet age, because we were working with that globe. There was no internet, there was no Google. We were assuming that the Earth was a perfect sphere. Each one of these lines that I taped onto the grid was about 1/8 of an inch thick, which was probably, 200 miles in width. And so when we said something was on then, it was much easier to be on than it is with that Google Earth map. But that first year, the university let me just do whatever I wanted to with my basic cultural anthropology class. And so I had them researching the Russians article, the Three Russians article. And as we did it, this was 1984, Chernobyl happened, and the Sudan locust plague happened. On the other side of the world, on this same great circle, the Valdez oil spill happened. And it was, it was kind of spooky to just watch it happen. And we wondered if, okay, well, if we're watching this line, is it that what's our interaction with this that we're so interested in it? So we called that the orienting ring, or orienting hoop, and we moved from there. Now this is just basically the five. I'm very invested in Plato because he had this figure described in the Timaeus. He had the 120 sphere ringed globe that we call UVG. He had that. And the essence of it, if you decode the text, is just that the five, those are called the Platonic forms. Is everybody familiar with those pretty much? Anybody not? They're basic figures that each side and angle of connection is identical. And within this white figure, which is the figure Plato described, the corners of each of the figures fit symmetrically so that they all will nest inside each other. And you can fit in 10 tetrahedrons, 5 cubes, 5 octahedrons, and a icosahedron and dodecahedron. And so what we were able to do, that shows the other two figures, was make a typology of where the different corners were having common placement on the globe with each other. So that Plato was always talking about a basic triangle. And if you look at it, you can see each triangle in this grid is identical. And so we were proposing that vertexes or points where intersections came together, that there would be common phenomena at all the icosahedron corners, at all the octahedron corners, and at all the bullseye corners that were a meeting of those three figures' points. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And whether or not it worked, I still don't know, but I'm pretty convinced that these figures, these corners, are very resource rich, very water rich, and I feel like that most of the icosahedron corners, and icosahedron stands for water, they're very near edges of continents, or they're actually in ocean. And the corners that are like this, often, this is Giza right here, they're often major waterworks. There's one in China, and there's one at Giza, obviously. There's one in the southwest United States. So we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was considered on an intersection and how we would type those. And I'm not sure how far we got, but I still think about that. This was my favorite part, being a musician, where we could hardly believe it. We made the assumption that the Earth was a sphere, which it really isn't. But and that's a big drawback with anybody using the UVG that's on the Google Earth, that program that I made, because it assumes that the Earth is a sphere. And I was thinking today and yesterday when the presentations were on the Michael Mary line that we could just be way off with that grid, because that one that's published so often, it's just a hand-drawn model, Bill did that. We were doing that from a globe, you know, and superimposing it on flat maps and trying to draw it. And it's very iffy, you know, and I'm totally convinced that the line that was presented yesterday is the line. I mean, I just don't see how there could be any question about that. And ours is probably just wrong. And so, you know, like, don't believe the UVG. But it is interesting to me that the sides of the triangles are pretty much those cosmic numbers, 1440, 2160, and 2592. This one, if you just add a 0 on it, it's the common number for precession in years. And you've probably seen, should I switch?
I'm going to switch in a second.
Oh. But you can actually play them. You could play the grid in that 144 is actually a frequency. 259.2 is a frequency. 216 is a frequency, and it'll play a blues chord.
Oh, I beg.
You know, and so you can go to sacred sites and take measurements between significant places on sites and immediately translate them into frequencies and play them. I know somebody else talked about this, but it's just fascinating. And so we thought, okay, we have discovered the harmony of the spheres, you know, and go into this big, you know. Should I just keep talking? The sky sphere, which are these things that I have here, happened really unintentionally. I didn't know anything about archaeology and, about astronomy. But I was so used to looking at a 12-inch globe all the time. Bill gave me this one year for a present. And I just had it on a shelf and I never looked at it. I just didn't. I like the color, and I always have myself surrounded with colors that I like. And then one night I looked and I thought, isn't that funny that the ecliptic, which is essentially the equator of a sky sphere. Sky sphere is just, if you really assume that everything that we see out in the sky is a sphere, even though it isn't, but you assume that it is, then you assume that you can get above that, which you can't. So it's all an imagined visualization. Everybody got that part? Because that's really critical. And when you have that, you're in the middle here. You're in the center of the sphere looking out, and I'm looking down, kind of like Horus. And I saw, okay, there's the ecliptic, and the Milky Way actually lay right exactly on a grid ring. I could see it. It wasn't gridded yet, but I'd looked so long at the lines on the Earth that I could see it. So I plotted it on there, and it was like that was the moment in my life where I thought, oh my, what is this? And I looked and I thought, I wonder if there's an orienting ring in the sky, like this one. And there was, because the ecliptic it has a north and south pole. So that's ecliptic north and south, which is different from celestial north and south, which is where the axis is pointing, where the axis of Earth is pointing. And the ecliptic is the Earth's path around the sun, but we're in the center there, we're seeing it as the sun around the Earth, so that's what it marks. And this orienting ring went right through the north and south ecliptic poles, and it ran through Sirius and Canopus and Vega, which I knew from mythology studies were 3 of the most important stars that showed up almost anywhere, and they're among the, I think it's among the 6 brightest in the sky. Sirius is the brightest. And in Dogon lore, this is a tribe in Mali that a lot of anthropologists like to study, the hole that the string goes through is named after Sirius. And so I started thinking of this as a bull roar, you know, and there was my ROM again. And so I always worked intuitively like that. You know, and so that's why I really consider my work more art than science. But it was very exciting to see that. And the other thing about finding that orienting ring that really did blow me away was that I found out that the June solstice sun aligned with that orienting ring in the sky in 1000 AD. And I had read enough myths from the, Bible myths and other myths talking about millennium fever and which cultures it did show up in and which it didn't. And I thought, isn't that odd that that ring that the solstice would be there at that date? And what you can do once you have a fixed date is that you can put the sun anywhere along that line and know the date. And so where we're headed in this presentation is that please, come on. I'm so bad with technology. At the place where the Milky Way crosses the ecliptic, can you see that point? Mm-hmm. And you can see the ecliptic going over. Here's the sun right now in 1000 AD. It's going to move over to the ecliptic in 2300. And about right now, the sun is approaching that. And I think that's part of the whole 2012 phenomenon, that we've moved into the space where there's some flux in the sky grid, and we're at a time, that's a huge crossing point. I'll talk about it more, but that's what got me interested in the calendar. Why the significance now? I can't just be the Mayans going to a single date. Now you already know about, I think I already told you about this, but I found out somewhat later that the root of the word rhomb, rho, means spinning and rotation, which I thought was interesting. And most of the linguists that I've talked with believe that the meaning rho for spinning came prior to its use for the rhomb in geometry. So somewhere in geometry, in the whole meaning of geometry, is spinning. You know, we always think of it as stable, but it's really spinning. And so all those megaliths that are constructed in those precise geometries are spinning. So they really are vortexes, you know, which was very... And this you already know about, but the most common shape of the bull roar in most cultures is the vesicopiscus. And the most common form that they're carved in is a fish. So the knowledge has been around for quite a while. So what I'm thinking is that the bull roars are like the iPad of stone circles, you know, where if you can't have one of those, you can carry your own little vortex around. Now this, I'm going to run through this really quickly, but this was just to show you where bull roars have been found, just so that you can see that they really are connected with ancient sites. This is Çatalhöyük, which is 7500 BC. A bull roar was found there. This one, there are bull roars on the floor of King Tut's tomb. There's this, I'm convinced that this is a bull roar, but they are called palettes. And they're smeared with red ochre, so they said that probably they were cosmetic palettes. But I think that they were instruments. And there are others in Egyptian collections that are shaped just like the rhomb on the sky grid up there by Orion and Sirius. In fact, this one, which is a replica from New Zealand, is how it actually appears in the sky. And Orion would be in the center of this if you were looking at it. And that's a pretty big detour. They're used, the first time that they show up in writing is in the Timaeus. No, not in the Timaeus, it's in another writing. But Dionysus, who's the god who's sacrificed by the Titans, he's given a magic wheel, a top, a bull roar, a mirror, and I think a sprig of pine tree as toys before he's killed and then reborn. And we know that that's some kind of an initiation across a threshold that was being described in that mythology. And to this day, in cultures maybe up until 1900, when some of the rituals were still authentic, the bull roars were used to call whatever this creative consciousness is at rituals of healing, youth initiation, marriage, fertility. If there'd been a killing, they would be used to call out how it had happened and how justice would be meted out. And they've always been used to call creative solution across a threshold. And they're usually associated in some way with both lightning and Orion. So I just thought this was kind of cool that they found a spiral galaxy right there, or a spiral electromagnetic current in Orion just a few years ago. And the magic wheel is attributed to Hecate, who's about 1000 BC. She's, and she uses the spinner to help people across thresholds. So both instruments are really initiatory and consciousness transforming by a planar spin and by a vertical spin. And in Christianity it shows up. If you look in churches, you'll see both Mary, the saints, Jesus, inside ROMs. You know, so that the idea of the spinning consciousness is kind of all around us, but we don't think about it because we've lost the meaning. And just very briefly, we've already talked about chakras. What's interesting is that the chakras are they're all geometrically regular. They're not random representations of those chakras. And what I think was happening is that the Ida and Pingala, that are they're like etheric aspects of the breath stream, the breath stream spins the chakras. And so both the bull roar and the magic wheels are the breath and voice of the creative. And so you have it within yourself. And if you use these instruments, you can really align your chakras just by breathing with them. It's the most interesting. This was what I was telling some folks earlier. I got Lyme's disease about 6 years ago and had to leave my teaching job for a while. And all I did was make chakra spinners and bull roars. And I got to, I haven't visited very many sites, to be honest, but I think when you do study something, that you really do take it into yourself and you start getting insights where you feel yourself being in another time. It's amazing to me what meditation will do. So this, the Olean spinner that I played for you right at the beginning, this was a total hunch, but I saw it. Does anybody recognize it?
That's the middle of the calendar.
It sure is.
For past stages.
Yep. That's exactly what it is. It's the middle of the Aztec calendar. And there it was sitting in there, and I thought, isn't that cool? I'm making that. And so with the spinners, you have to be really careful with where you put the holes for the string to come through, because if they're even a 1/16 of an inch off, sometimes they won't spin. And so I copied that, and I did exactly where those two nostril things are, and it worked perfectly. So I hereby declare the center of the calendar is a magic wheel. But the same pattern shows up in other cultures with the design on it definitely used as a spinner. I haven't seen an Aztec one, but I believe that that's what the calendar, that it's the spin. And it's interesting that that figure is named Ehecatl, and it's one letter different from Hecate. And so I'm wondering which way things went. A lot of the time I wonder what went from here to there and what went from there to here. That I think we make it too much maybe from there to here. I was just down in Peru at a set of ceremonies, and I'll tell you, I thought I was in a Catholic Mass, and I was in the middle of the rainforest in Peru. And the celebrant offering up a cup, it was amazing. And not Christians, it was very, let's see. This you might just like if you want to get a human attachment to geometry, that the word geometry you probably know means geometr, which can be earth, mother, or earth measure. She's married to Uranus, and the way that she liberates life on Earth is that she gets Kronos to find a bull roarer, only she calls it a flint knife. But the flint knife tradition from Australia and several other places make them both be the same instrument. Bull roarers were made out of flint and used as knives and used in circumcision ceremonies. So the knife, the bull roarer, the rhomb, initiates life on Earth. Their daughter, one of them is Mnemosyne, and you probably know a mnemonic device. So geometry and the universe give birth to memory. She has a fling with Zeus, who's the ruler of the heaven. Their children are the arts and sciences. And Zeus is the father of Dionysus, who's the first person in Greek tradition that gets spin, the rhombos and all that before he's killed, and then comes back to life. So there's a really deep, vortex, spiral, reincarnational philosophy built into the geometry. And you've seen all this, but the forms are amazingly prevalent in nature. And I know when I first saw the model of the Earth with two Russian figures on it, my first reaction was actually just total relief that we weren't a blob. Because just to think that there was some regularity or some predictability in what was on the planet was just so nurturing. And I think that's why I stayed so attached to it. Now the hoops theory is essentially an American Indian belief. And if you, the Lakota Sioux tradition, which is the one that I know best, says that the Creator called the hoops to form Earth, the 15 hoops to form Earth, and set them in the 16th hoop, which I've decided is the way I interpret it, and I've talked to some of them, and they think this is probably right, but who knows what's right in myth, that the Earth's equator is the 16th hoop.
The equator or the orbit?
Huh?
The equator or the orbit? It's the 16th.
Oh, you're right. The orbit around the Earth. I'm sorry. Thank you, Dan. And just for your own ability to think about this, I don't know whether this is right, this is how I understand it, that the cross circle, which commonly represents the medicine wheel, is really almost one of these kind of models where you're looking down on it, so that the cross is a hoop, set on a hoop, so that it's really that's a radiolarian, but so that it's really a total sphere that we're talking about rather than a circle. So it's, how you honor the above and the below beings and all that. So they're the same thing. It's just that Plato never got beyond triangles and shapes. And the Indian tradition takes it all into this movement that people have been talking about. And it's, I'm going to go over this, but I think of the hoops as like really, really, really tight springs that open very slowly, but they're always spiraling. Because that's us moving around the Milky Way and around the sun. Now this, I think you may find interesting. I want to move into the sky grid, but if the hoops have energy, if it's really an energetic thing that's coming out from our Milky Way, and whatever it is that we're mapping with this, there's a phenomenon going on that maybe some of you have heard about where the Milky Way is cannibalizing another galaxy. Has anybody heard about that? Well, you won't believe it, but yeah, the Magellanic Dwarf Cloud and this one, this is the film of the Sagittarius Dwarf. Oh, please, come on. Oh, this is so disappointing. Well, I'm not going to wait. What it does, it flies in just like that, and the Milky Way grabs it, and it pulls it right into a ring. And it pulls it into a ring that is, here's the Milky Way. Here's the Sagittarius Dwarf Stream right on another grid ring. And the same thing with the Magellanic Cloud. And I've verified that with, that's not something I thought up on here, I verified that with an astronomer out in Colorado. That when they come in, when they pull in these other, when the Milky Way starts cannibalizing, it's actually pulling it, whatever that energy is that we're talking about, that the Milky Way it's taking this grid pattern. Would anybody like to get up and stretch? A few people look really sleepy. It's hard when it's so dark. So sorry you can't see that.
What about down the lower left there? What are those things?
Oh, they'll just shut the show off.
See if we can get the animation.
Yeah. Do you know how to do it?
I'll have a look.
See, I haven't got the...
Where is it? Where's the screen?
Oh, wait.
Oh, it's the-
I know. Maybe, well, don't worry about it. I want to just... But with all of this, here comes critical self again. You can align a lot of traditional cosmic figures with the pattern. And you see there I have the figure aligned by the solar plexus chakra at the center of the face of the dodecahedron. Now look at this. Same figure at the center of the face of the icosahedron. You know, it's very, you can really fool yourself with the illusions of what's going on. And this is what frightens me, is this dance of illusions that, see how similar they are, where the arms and legs appear to align? And they're two different geometries. Just all I did was I moved it to the sacral chakra for my alignment. And so with the grid, you know, like I could say that the orienting line was on the pyramid, but it was actually 4 miles off. And with, we already talked about this, it has its own problems. Here's Chernobyl, which is 92 miles away, but we called it on. And there's Nazca, and this is our tetrahedron edge coming down through the middle of the valley. But so it's 7 miles from the Nazca Plain, but what does that mean? And that was where I got frustrated with the Earth grid, just because every place started being sacred, and I could find a way where absolutely everything lined up. There's another one where they found this beautiful new crab, and that we know that they line up on ocean ridges, but you know, is that real or is that? And then that is the grid intersection in South Australia that a friend of mine and a research team has been working on for years based on the grid. Here's the grid, so there's almost no site that's not on an intersection. And so what I'm not covering is all the things that are outside this region to know whether the whole of Australia is covered with sacred sites, which it probably is. That's what's tricky. And this pretty much was the beginning of the end of my marriage to Bill. Because we went one year on a 9,000-mile VW grid trip, and because I wanted to get picked up by a UFO, and he wanted the research to end, and we got to Pecos, Texas, which was like on the map. We had a Rand McNally atlas, and we go into town. There's this huge sign that says, "Home of the famous Pecos cantaloupe. Ronald Reagan eats one every day." And I said, "That's a phenomenon. We're going to write that down." And he says, "We're not going to write that down." And I said, "Yes, we are." And we had the same fight in Hot Springs, Arkansas, because we drive into town. There's another great big banner that said, "Guinness Book of Records, world's largest brown trout caught here." And he says, "You can't write that down. You can't." Yes, I can. It's a living organism. And so we'd go through that. And but I was telling my friend David, I looked today on the internet, and somebody else now has the largest brown trout. But on the Hot Springs, Arkansas website, there's a disclaimer saying, "We are the home of the largest official naturally raised channel catfish." So they got to keep their. But it is hard what especially when you're both academics and you're every piece of knowledge that you let out. I think Jeff was talking about this yesterday, that you have to keep some data close to your chest. And with the sky calendar or the sky grid, once I started treating it as a calendar, we got into more arguments because of the implications for current times by what appeared to be a astronomical phenomenon in the past. So I'll talk a little bit about that. You've probably seen this. I don't want to spend. How much time do I have left?
About 20.
Oh, okay. This is just that they found spinning up a plane thing in water. Eventually, geometric forms emerge at the bottom of a spinning vortex. This was really important research. And it was all leading me in the direction of, okay, maybe I can trust these things. And that is actually water spouts, but this is exactly what happens with bull roars and rituals. When I saw that, I was thinking sometimes in classic initiation rituals in New Guinea, they would have 300 or 400 people on the beach, and the initiates would be up above the beach under baskets and told, if you shit your pants, you're dead. This thing will eat you. And so they're under the basket cowering, and these 500 people swing their bull roars like you would do a wave in a football stadium and make it seem like this thing is going up and down the beach. And they had incredible ways, Donald Tuzin used to write about this, of getting in synchrony where just like these little windspouts do when they join together and form a hurricane. It's exactly the same process that they replicate with sound with these bull roars. And it's used in initiation to kind of introduce you to the power and the fear and the awe and the reality that you as humans have some control also by generating the sound. So here is where I was in Corral, and that's about as close of a representation of the spiral that I found on the I didn't find it, the guide showed it to me, but it's become actually the national commercial symbol of Peru now. They have Peru with the P is a great big spiral with the leg coming down, for P. And even here, they found they're 5,000-year-old bone flutes that right around the mouth there's a rhomb, you know, for the breath spiral to go down into the flute. And they were, at that time even, weaving rhombic God's eyes. And this particular civilization here is, there's no fudge factor. It is 100 years older than the Giza pyramid. So, and the archaeology, anthropology view is still that they're looking for a mother culture, and they couldn't figure out why all this megalithic building was occurring right around 3000, 2900, 27, that area, why it all started. So currently, Peru is kind of, the energy is kind of shifting to look at Peru because that's the oldest huge site like this, and it. What I just loved about it is that it's on that kind of an intersection with three colors, where dodec, cube, and tetrahedron corners meet. It's got fantastic water. It has fantastic ability to grow crops. The site itself is set on a sandy plain, but around it, it's one of the most fertile areas for growing in Peru. And in historic times, that spiral that I was talking about of relationships between people and plants and growing, they would grow cotton at Corral, and then it would be traded for anchovies down at the coast. And so there was a constant exchange system going, and it got bigger and bigger. And I thought, well, maybe they were doing the seed thing with the cotton up there. You know, because it's a huge megalithic site. It's just enormous. I think there are 77 pyramids there, and there's no evidence of any violence or warfare, no walls. And the central plaza seems to me like it was about at more than a football field circumference with the big structures around it, and they said that area was used for regular people coming into market and trading. You know, so it was an amazing site, and it's still not entirely well known. So we're back here to Tecpotl, and to Tlaxteotl, and the bull roarer again, which do you see it on the calendar? Now this is where I think this is probably the heart of what I've been looking at. Here's my spinner. Here's the nostrils. Here's the flint knife, which may be a bull roarer, sticking out of his mouth. And see, it comes down, pointing to that ring, which are the day glyphs that are around, huddled around Tlaxteotl. When you looked at it, just all random. They've always been called days. I think that they are celestial days, like zodiac signs. I think there's a lot. I can't go through the evidence with this. There's a lot in Maya literature, and there's not enough that I know in Aztec, but where they will show the day glyphs hanging on an illustration of the ecliptic, and the ecliptic is where we see all our zodiac. So if the bull roar is related to Orion, which it always is, if it's pointing down between those two day glyphs, what is it pointing to, and why? And well, it's pointing between the dog and the monkey. And in Aztec literature, and this, I'm just trying to build this case that the knife might be a bull roar, that that's the beginning of an eclipse. And they say that this was how the great mother of Aztec creation was created, by being impregnated by an obsidian knife. So I thought, okay, I can think of that as an obsidian knife. And in the tradition of Gaia and Uranus, Gaia isn't impregnated, but she needs to have one of her children castrate Uranus with an obsidian knife in order to release children into the world. So there's some kind of a symmetry there that I decided to go with. And I was interested in the dog being there because that would be the position of Sirius if it were on the ecliptic. And I was interested in the monkey being there because in some of the representations of Thoth, who I can't pretend to know much about, he's portrayed as a ape-headed divine figure. So I thought, well, maybe an ape and a monkey are the same thing, because on the on the Egyptian calendar, Roman Egyptian, there's also a dog right next to. Here's the same bull roarer shape. One of these, I believe this is the one. This is the ape-headed Thoth. And over here is Sirius. So if I aligned the two calendars just based on this fish-shaped pillar that's related to Osiris, because Osiris, when he's killed, is put into a pillar, and Osiris is related to Orion, and you can make a lot of leaps. It might be wrong, but I could superimpose the Aztec calendar right on top of the Dendera zodiac, and I found that the arms of the figure on the calendar, they're much more pronounced here. You can see them. I just wanted to abstract it. They create 20 segments, like the 20 days of the Aztec calendar, and as I've researched it, there's a crocodile on both of them in exactly the same place. And this has just been a matter of years where I've been trying to know enough about the mythology to be able to sift it down. But so now, you can take the same calendar and put the Greek zodiac on top of it, and the places where it lines up are the fixed signs in our astrology system. So at least it's a calendar across the oceans that line up. And where I'm going with it is that if we have both those calendars, if there really is a timeline that can be fixed to that Aztec calendar and to the mythologies of what was going on, then we have another way to look at anything that we can date. Am I making sense? And so, and somebody described precession, so I'm not going to do that again. But this period of time starting in 1750 is when the June solstice sun, it's now moved, at that time it's moved there. It's going to take it about 1,000 years, that one degree every 72 years, to move across the Milky Way. And it's going to do that on right now it's on the summer solstice side of the Earth. There's on the opposite side of the Earth where the ring goes around is the winter solstice. And so it'll take the winter solstice about 1,000 years to move across that. And in just about all cultures, I think several people have talked about this, those points in time when the solstice sun is going across the Milky Way, those are the doors to the afterlife. And if you're on the Orion side, you do the afterlife into the realm of the divine. And if you're on the other, if it's on the other side, it's the afterlife with the ancestors. And so the dead are traveling at these times. And it's way too complex to explain because I don't get it, but you probably... So if we can date all this, which is what I've done, every age in the Aztec and in the other calendar I can assign a date to. And so that you can look at what's going on at the ecliptic with the zodiac story in either culture as the meaning of those symbols. So that you actually have a story being told with the zodiac of what's going to happen. And if you can put a date on it in both calendars, then you can almost see why why civilizations would have stopped a certain kind of development, because the story says, nope, not now, move. And I have been collecting times when these things have happened correlated with changes of day. And you really have very interesting ones. The more interesting thing to me right now is that the large story is at the North Ecliptic Pole, which is where Draco is. Down here at the, here's the end of a day. Each one of these is the end of an Aztec day. In 300 BC, Alexander the Great dies. We don't even know if Alexander the Great existed. He could have been a mythology. And I think each one of these days is 1,300 years. And here's Alexander the Great right here. Here's the orienting ring at 1000 AD. So that makes me think that the fixing of where the 0 point was in AD, BC, or CE and BCE, is geometrically fixed so that you're processing towards these doors at the Milky Way. So that it's not arbitrary where 0 is. And Christ is a phenomenon of 1,000 years, and then you get this other phenomenon. And at 1000 AD, you had people all over the world setting up observatories and universities, I think, trying to track what time it was. So that you did come to some kind of a global agreement on where we were in the sky. And the Maya took it to a high art because they were so precise. They may have done themselves in like we were with the grid lines. And again, it sticks around in Christianity. This thing down here, you recognize the double coil in the tail? You know who it is? It's Draco. I mean, it even says Draco, so I'm not making that up. There he is. But so the pole story, that's the path of the pole over the 25,900 years. It's moving, 1 degree every 72 years. If you look at this side right here, 10700 BC is about the time when everything went haywire on the planet. There's a lot being written on that. Maybe you've seen some of the books on this, I don't know, but huge catastrophes around the world in that date, which is when the foot of Achilles comes right down on the dragon head. And what does that mean? To have the beginning of an age be right in the jaws of the dragon, and then for all these years, you can look at all these constellations around it and imagine what the story would have been. This is just like the the Cliff's Notes version of what's going on at the ecliptic. And so here's the dragon, just horrible, horrible influence maybe. You never know what was going on. Why did all the wars start? Why did all that happen? To the point where right here, at 1000 AD, in some ways, we're out of the most intense influence of Draco. He's still there, he's still wrapped around the pole, but here, there's a change. And so now we have this little gap between that change and here, where the pole's moving essentially on this side of the Earth into the Milky Way. By 1750, it's moving into the Milky Way. The illustration isn't so good on this globe, but it's, because it's down, the pole's down there, but this is the axial pole.
Yeah.
And so where's, 2012 is like here. And so do you call that on? Do you say, okay, what is 2012 a date, or is 2012 a ritual event that we really needed to say, okay, this is real, we're starting again? Because we're moving out of the influence of whatever that nasty energy of Draco is. That's how I just think of it that way. I may be wrong. But past 2012, the pole actually proceeds right up the chakras of Cepheus the king. And Cepheus is, probably related to head. And as soon as it goes out his crown chakra, this is the most amazing part of precession. The pole of the Earth is actually lying almost parallel to the Milky Way. It's floating in the Milky Way. And that, all the rest of the time, we're polarized. Because and Plato talks about this in the other book, in Critias. It's the other half of Timaeus and Critias, where he says that the people were moving along and they were happy and they were drinking the pure milk of the gods, and they didn't realize it until they started to drink other things, impurities. And I think that it was a metaphor for the pole. As it precessed, it moved out of the Milky Way, and then you have energetic sources coming into the planet from both sides, and it's just a different phenomenon than if you're lying flat in that mother milk. And the pole stayed flat like that for almost 4,000 years. And I would period the last time around Lascaux was painted. And we don't have much anything left from then, but it just gives you a way to think about dates and what might have been happening and why certain constellations or others might have been inscribed on the landscape. Or this, Perseus's sickle looked a lot like that lunar figure, the planisphere figure. There are just so many things that we will see what we're looking for and don't really know. So anyway, I'm sure I'm over my time, but I guess that's it. Spirals that Hugh showed in his show. Great big spirals, probably this big across. And the whole, everything in that site, the life of the people, the plants, the water, the pyramids, the trade system, everything is a vortex, a living vortex. And it's kind of changed my view of how to think about vortexes and how to think about all these energy lines and telluric currents and everything that we've been talking about today. this, oddly enough, has been my inspirational goddess since I began all this work. This is Tlazolteotl, who's an Aztec aspect of the feminine. They don't really use the divine down there, but I think I've put it in my show sometimes. But if you look at her, there are several things in this representation that I think encompass both the philosophy of the Earth grid and what will be the sky grid, as well as a way of humans living within all this energy. That's probably my focus, is how humans have interpreted and lived within the context of this energy that all of you are focusing upon, and made stories about it, made rituals to attach themselves more fully to it. So what she's actually doing is defecating. And she's called the goddess of filth, but as you can see up here, Aztec, I can't speak Nahuatl, but the language is, from everything I've read about it, it's very poetic in that they'll build these little kinds of etymological closenesses into the ways that they name things, so that filth, tlazol, and tlazol, filth and love are pretty much the same thing. And filth is just our word, but it's really waste, which is turning into corn, which is fertilizing the soil, which is coming back as food. And that's very much influenced me. Here under this foot, she has an instrument that I have been making that's called a bull roar, which will be one of the corners of this talk. You've probably seen them tour Spickle in New Age Journal in 1975, and I kept the magazine because there was an interview with Jerry in there, and then 5 years later, I ran into a picture of the Russian Earth grid, and it was on the other side of the article about Jerry Garcia, so I kept it. But I hadn't even seen it, so I credit him in having that. But this Ivan Sanderson really probably started the icosahedron on the globe argument, saying that each one of these areas, so this is the Bermuda Triangle, Hawaii, the Japan Devil's Sea, those. He talked about this on the Arthur Godfrey show. And I bet there isn't anybody here old enough to remember. Well, maybe some people. My mom ironed to it, And Arthur, I still don't know whether it was right, but that's where that came from. Pretty much simultaneously, the Russians, and Chris Bird said, don't call them the Russians because that's just like saying the United States people. But it was an engineer and a linguist and a historian. And I was lucky enough in 1994 to actually get to visit Valery Makarov, who was the engineer. And so he told me the story of how they had come up with their grid, and it was basically that two of the men met on a train going to a conference and got to talking about this and thought, man, we should do this. It was just that simple of a thing. But they started not with Giza. Like I just assumed that the archaeological evidence with the megaliths that are on the various grid points would have been what they started with. No, they didn't. They started with the dodecahedron on the Earth, and they aligned it with the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And when they did that, putting two of the centers of the pentagons at the north and south axial pole, they found that the alignment was true. Then, when they overlaid the other figure, the icosahedron, onto the Earth symmetrically on top of that, the archaeological sites and the geological stuff and the topography and it's really wonderful to be here. When I was listening to the last talk, I was thinking that Hugh is the first person who's pulled me out from under one of those rocks since 1986. I haven't spoken publicly about the grid or any of this since then because I had severe crisis of confidence. I'm one of those evil anthropologists, PhD'd and everything, and my sense of critical judgment kicks in so hard on myself that I felt pretty much tongue-tied by my research, and I'll tell you part of the story of how I got to where I am now, but I spent about 10 years in retreat with musical instruments, making them, playing violin, and working on the sky grid that I'm going to present today for the first time. And I am just in awe of what I've heard already at this conference. It practically brought me to tears. Just this past summer, I turned my granite boulder-filled backyard into a garden, and when you said that that was just what you need in rock dust, I'm thinking I'm going to go home and lick my rocks. I mean, everything that I've heard has expanded me so much. I'm really moved to be here. So this is our front porch, and I started out in sustainability, and these are our solar cookers, which bring magical vortex sun energy to cook our food. And so I guess I've always been interested in vortexes, but I've kind of stood back from them just because I was academic until fairly recently, when I went to Corral, which is the Peruvian site that Hugh talked about, at point 35 on our grid, and at the foot of the Menor Pyramid. I don't know if any of you have been there, but I have a slide of it coming up. Carved on the main platform in front of that pyramid is one of those spiral power ritual instruments, and they're very practical. And also in, well, I'll tell you this later. Those are some of the old ones, just so you can see how the form over all those thousands of years has stayed pretty much the same. Now the geometric figure that has been important in the way that Bill Becker and I developed the grid, the most important form is the rhomb, which is this figure. And the earliest time that we hear about the bull roar, the name given to it is rhombos. And the earliest name given to this was Greek just because that's where the writing is that I can read and that most academics can read. They can't read Hindu very well yet. This was also rhombos. So I'll return to that. But I have that rhomb. This is the Hindu Sri yantra. Is anybody familiar with that? It's the graphic symbol for the mother goddess. And I noticed, I got to looking at rhomb so much that I realized that I could lay the center of it right over the human midbrain. So now part of my thinking about who we are as consciousness is that here's our midbrain at the end of our spinal cord, and it's a rhombic form. And all the traditions talk about the brain essentially being a spinning being, a being of intertwined spinning energies. So that's another influence in this. Now just briefly, I don't think I'm going to have to go over the grid too much since so many people have talked about it, but I love John Michel. I knew him very briefly, but I have to say that my primary influences for the grid were Chris Bird, who wrote The Secret Life of Plants, who was very kind to us with his research. And probably I have to acknowledge the Grateful Dead. I'm a musician. I absolutely love those guys. And there was an art on one at the beginning of his film. And they're just flat. Get it going and not hit the microphone. And whoever spins it will have a unique voice. But this also, as you can see, it has a vortex as a horizontal plane, and it has a spinning plane. So it's a vortex generator. And the other instrument that's under her other foot, This one is something that some of you may have played with as a child. It's called a magic wheel. You might have played with one with string through a big coat button. And so I made one in that shape, but you can, and I'll be talking more about all of these. Just get them around a couple of fingers. And that shape that she has here is the glyph for movement. And then the other figures that are surrounding her are the day glyphs in the Aztec calendar. So that's one of my primary inspirations in this talk. And then there's your, and the bull roar, interestingly enough, has been found all over the world. And the oldest one was found near Chauvet Cave in France, and it's 40,000 years old. It was carved out of mammoth bone. And so I think that they have 7 or 8 surviving examples of a bull roar from that period, but mostly they call them fugitive artifacts because they just disintegrate. So we really don't have too much of a straight history, but if we're lucky and we pick through history and we find a site with stuff in it, often we find a bull roar. And it's one, if you do go back into ancient history, you find that the magic wheel, this thing, a fire drill that you spin to start fire, loom spindle, spinning top, and the bull roar are very commonly considered to be power